Director Programs and Administration at Defend Defenders. We also do have Mr. James Bidal, the head of Secretariat at the South Sudan Human Rights Defenders Network. And lastly, we do have Dr. Marie-Louise Barichako. She is the chairperson for Movement Inamahoro. So who is a human rights defender? That's what we want to unpack today. And what are some of the interventions that have been put in place to build their resilience in that regard? Talking about Uganda, by the year 2019, over 38 NGOs had their offices broken into by security operatives in that regard, in some cases leaving a trail of blood. That led to censorship in some areas. Some human rights defenders decided to censor themselves, myself inclusive, during that period, because it was really dangerous to actually operate during that period. But then organizations like Defend Defenders are actually pretty much working so hard to strengthen the work of human rights defenders in the wake of governments pushing back. So why are governments within the region trying so hard to delegitimize the good work of the human rights defenders? Why are they seeing us as the enemy? Yet we are actually working so hard to ensure that the human rights of several citizens within the region are protected in that regard. So those are some of the issues we're going to be breaking down on this show. Do not forget the 4th Hybrid General Assembly that was actually put in place by Defend Defenders as the Secretariat of the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Network kick-started. That is yesterday on the 6th of October, and it's going to be climaxing today on the 7th of October. Several issues are on the table, including DRC. It's not a member of Defend Defenders, so we want to know, what does DRC have to do to ensure that they are actually one of the members of Defend Defenders in that regard, or the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Network, to ensure that even the human rights of the individuals within that area or jurisdiction are protected, and the human rights defenders alike are also protected within the DRC. But we are now talking about membership being drawn from Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Djibouti. You also have Ethiopia, Eritrea are some of the countries that draw membership from Defend Defenders as the Secretariat of the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Network. But first off, let's get to know the mandate of Defend Defenders. And let me kickstart that conversation with Memory Bandera, the Programs Director at the Director Programs and Administration at the Defend Defenders. Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on NTV Uganda. Let me start with you, Memory Bandera. Let's kickstart with the simplest of questions. Who is a human rights defender? Why are governments working so hard to delegitimize the good work that these individuals have been orchestrating since time immemorial?
Thank you, Romeo, for having us on the show. And good morning, viewers. Really glad to be on this show to break down the definition of a human rights defender. When we talk about a human rights defender, it could be me, it could be you.
Indeed.
It really depends on the act that you're doing to protect someone else's rights. And we draw our definition of a human rights defender from the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which looks at a human rights defender as somebody who's protecting other people's rights using peaceful means. So we cannot use violence. It has to be peaceful. And these rights vary from your economic, social, and political rights. It could be political rights. It could be any right that you're looking at, women's rights, children's rights. Whatever right you're protecting is covered under this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So as Defend Defenders, we come in to provide protection, to provide support to those people that are speaking on behalf of others. So we don't go into the communities and implement the day-to-day activities, but our role is to take a step back and say, okay, when people are in the field, they're protecting other people's rights, who is looking after them? So that's where we come in as Defend Defenders to say, can we make sure that the people that are on the ground, they have somebody they can run to when they are in trouble. They have somebody they can run to when they need support in specific skills and tools to enable them do their work.
When did it dawn on us as Defend Defenders that now we have to switch focus away from the people whom we were actually focusing on, trying to protect their human rights, and now switch our focus to the human rights defender themselves? Why did we switch, and when did it dawn on us that it's important now to focus on the human rights defender other than the citizens whom we were actually fighting so hard to ensure that their human rights are protected?
So protection of human rights defenders could be said is a fairly new phenomenon, starting in 1998
Indeed.
with the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders that was adopted at the General Assembly, at the UN General Assembly. And this has also been now adopted at the African level through the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which recognizes the importance of human rights defenders and the need to protect the human rights defenders so that they're able to go into the field and actually do the protection of other people's rights. So for us, in our case as defenders, of course the UN established that mandate, but there were no practical mechanisms to implement that mechanism.
Indeed.
And what we did as defenders in 2005, our executive director was actually in exile in Canada. He's Somali. He was exiled in Canada, and he was with other African human rights defenders.
Indeed.
And they looked around and they said, what are we doing in Canada? He always talks about finding himself during winter and being very cold in Canada. And realizing that there was need to come back and contribute to the continent.
Indeed.
And not just living in exile. And that's when a group of human rights defenders decided that it was time not to run away from the continent, but to come back and be able to work on the continent and contribute to the continent. And then coming up with a mechanism that would then protect the work of human rights defenders. So that's when Defenders was founded in 2005.
Indeed.
To make sure that that platform is available for human rights defenders to work on the continent and to be safe.
So the viewer who is watching this program is now wondering, why have governments within the region now levied too much focus on the good work of the human rights defenders? Before, they were working very well with human rights defenders. NGOs in the north were working full-time with the central government. Well, of course, when this government came in 1986, many people thought, well, good governance is going to come about, you understand, democracy is going to come about, because there was no rule of law before independence and after independence. I'm talking about the Amin administration and the Obote administration 1 and 2. So when we did establish the 1995 constitution, we did have the Uganda Human Rights Commission set up within that same period, and we did see a lot of work being done by NGOs in close proximity with the central government. You understand, from the year 2000, northern Uganda, you saw what happened, but now what we are seeing is a pullback from the central government, and they're trying to push back NGOs. What went wrong? Why are they being perceived as the enemy? The human rights defenders, not only in Uganda, Burundi as well. You do have so many of the human rights defenders who are being pushed back into censorship. Our own Dr. Marie lives in Rwanda, not our own country, Burundi. James Bidal was also telling me that in southern Sudan, the same is happening. They are being attacked by government security parties. So we would like to know, why are governments so critical of the good work being done by human rights defenders?
That's a very good question. If I may start by just saying that not all human rights defenders are under the limelight. Indeed. And not all of them are at risk. But the question comes in on the action of human rights defenders. Indeed. When you're effective, when you speak truth to power, that's when the issue comes in. If you notice in these countries that you're mentioning, there are specific issues that come in, I think, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. As a journalist, if you come out to speak about specific issues, you will come under the limelight, because then you're raising your voice over issues that people might not necessarily want you to talk about because of probably the failure to deliver on that specific aspect. So right now there has been a global pandemic. When you start looking deeply into the health issues, you're going to realize that there are some things that are not right in the system. And the moment you start speaking about them, you can actually be at risk as a journalist.
Indeed.
So these issues are very contextual, depending on what's happening in a particular country and what issues human rights defenders are talking about, then they come under limelight. So we have cases, very high-level cases, where people are talking about national issues, they become at risk. And then you also have individuals who are talking about your everyday survival issues. Indeed. And they're also at risk. And one thing that I also want to clarify is that the risk that human rights defenders face comes at different level.
Indeed.
It comes from within the communities. So we also demystify the fact that human rights defenders are at risk because of state aggression. It's not just by the
even
state.
the communities themselves.
It's also the communities.
Cultural biases.
So depending on what issues you're working on, you can come under attack. But I also want to mention that human rights defenders play a very critical role within our countries. You know, there is access to health. I just talked about the pandemic. Access to health. Human rights defenders play a very big role to make sure that people have that access. Access to education. Making sure that there is sensitization. When the elections are coming up, are people sensitized enough to know what to do? You know, so human rights defenders are the vehicle that then drives countries to stay on track. When you talk about sustainable development goals, who makes sure that those goals are achieved. Most of the part, it's human rights defenders who raise their voices and hold governments accountable to make sure that they deliver on those goals.
All right, that is Memory Bandera. She is the Director of Programs and Administration at Defend Defenders. Defend Defenders is the Secretariat of the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Network. All right, let's talk to James Vidal. He is the Head of Secretariat at the South Sudan Human Rights Defenders Network. Mr. James Vidal, a very good morning once again. Well, in my country here, when President Museveni came into power in 1986, we thought arbitrary arrests would be a thing of the past. We thought kidnaps would be a thing of the past. Detention without trial, we thought, would be a thing of the past. But the same ugly scenes have started to surface in my beautiful country, Uganda, in recent times. Talk to us about Southern Sudan. Are you also sharing the same debacle within that country?
Yeah, thank you. The context in South Sudan is undoubtedly the same as per the context in Eastern Horn of Africa. There are a lot of negative developments, and particularly when it comes to universalities of human rights. They are often challenged, and also when it comes to democratic values, faces numerous threats. So it's not exceptional. That's why you find there are different attacks on human rights defenders, including people who defend freedom of expressions. Those are particularly journalists. And this is simply because the work of human rights normally touches the interests of both the state and non-state actors. That's why in most cases human rights defenders are put on the spotlight whenever they bring public concern to the attention of the authority, or when they speak they normally face like high level of reprisal. They are subjected to arbitrary arrest and detention. It's not exceptional. South Sudan is like Uganda and other countries in Africa, so such occurrences are happening. We have systematically documented a number of incidents where human rights defenders are arbitrarily arrested and detained. The worst is that they sometimes end up being released without any charges, and for fear of their lives some end up going to the exile. So this is the reality that is happening in South Sudan, simply because we don't have the space to express ourselves, and when civil society express voices which are critical, then they become subject of the state and they'll definitely be arrested and detained.
And like Bandera was saying, the human rights violations could not only be state orchestrated but also communal. Talk to us about cultural biases that are also leading to human rights defenders being targeted in that regard.
Yeah, thank you. When you take South Sudan, it has like 64 tribes, and there are different kind of ethnic affiliations with different cultures. There are those which look into human rights issues as negative. And when you stand and you're a defender today, you stand about a particular issues that face this a different community or within the community, and then I think you become a target by those particular community. For instance, if we talk about issues to do with early and girl-child marriage, then it becomes sensitive, because there are those cultures that normally groom ladies for the purpose of marriage. They don't value education. So today, if you go to that community and talk about girl-child education, then you'll become an enemy. Even those with the state power can order for your arrest. So this is the dynamics that are happening, and the girl child is also subjected. In South Sudan, we have different kind of settings. There are communal and ethnic killings. Once a community attack another community, and then you find that if someone is dead, then the girl child will be used for compensation. These are realities that are happening, and if you're a defender who stands to defend and talk that and denounce, such occurrences, and then you become a target. You can specifically be targeted by that community, or someone with the state powers can also use the state authorities to intimidate and arrest you or eliminate you. So these are the realities and the constructions that are happening within the settings of South Sudan.
You're saying in the event of an intertribal conflict, if a family member dies, they'll get the young lady and give her to the other side as compensation?
Yes, it happens, yeah. These are realities that happen. From one context to the other one, other communities will prefer receiving a girl child for compensation. Others would prefer receiving head of cattle. So where you don't have the head of cattle, I think that girl child has to be taken as compensation, and they have to groom her to raise, the deserved head of cattle from that particular girl. So these are one of the cultures that are affecting us as human rights defenders.
What are the cultures?
These barbaric cultures, I can term them, that do not allow the culture of human rights to flourish. Despite the fact that we were born with rights and freedoms, you find that such negative cultures normally impede the enjoyment of our full rights. So it's a cross-cutting issue within the country, and also South Sudan is blessed with a different kind of natural resources. In South Sudan, we have the natural forest, and we also have the oil fields.
Indeed.
So defenders who are particularly working around the oil fields and also where the forests are, because those are strategic locations that normally earn income to both the communities and also the country. So rights are being violated there.
Environmental rights.
Yeah, like the oil spills affects, the lives of people living within the environment.
Indeed.
So if you're a defender who also denounces that, and then you become a target.
You're attacked.
Because indirectly you are tampering with the income of that particular community leader, whose interest is to get, certain percentage within the extraction of the oil and also the logging of the forest. So you find that they have like different kind of attacks to defenders within the country.
Wow. That is the situation analysis of what is happening within Southern Sudan, courtesy of the head of the Secretariat there, Mr. James Bidal. Thank you so much for bringing that to light. Also, we also have Dr. Marie-Louise Barichako. She is the chairperson of Movement in Amahoro. She is born in Burundi, but she actually resides within Rwanda. Why? Would like to know. Why did she decide to flee in a country that is regarded to have become progressive after the death of Nkurunziza and after Evariste Ndayishimiye became president? Many people, including myself, thought, well, Burundi might be headed for democratic times, rule of law and so forth, better governance taking center stage at the hands of Evariste Ndayishimiye. But the same status quo has been maintained. Human rights defenders are being attacked left, right and center, which compelled Dr. Marie-Louise to actually leave that country and reside within Rwanda. So we want to get a situation analysis of what happened within Burundi before she left and what continues to happen to human rights defenders within that jurisdiction. Very good morning once again, Dr. Marie-Louise. Thank you once again for joining us. Bring us up to speed with the situation analysis on what is happening within Burundi, especially towards the welfare of the human rights defenders in that country.
Thank you very much. Actually, the situation Burundi is going through starts back in 2015. The one who was president of Burundi, Pierre Nkurunziza, he decided against the constitution and the Arusha Peace and Reconciliation Agreement to be a candidate for a third term.
Indeed.
And many human rights organizations, many political parties and actors were not of that view that the Constitution and the Arusha Peace and Reconciliation Agreement could be violated. So they started now peaceful demonstrations, which were followed by a lot of human rights violations. Indeed. And where really those who were demonstrating underwent a very harsh treatment. Some were killed, some were tortured, some were put to prison, some were forced into exile, others disappeared. the situation became very bad, and a lot of violence and a lot of human rights violations, and many found themselves, like me, in exile.
Indeed.
All those who were speaking about human rights, rule of law, could not be allowed to continue working in Burundi. At one point, the late President Pierre Nkurunziza himself, he said, those who are against us, they have three choices. Either be silent, or go into exile, or die. Those were the three choices. So when you hear that there are those three choices, you know that if you want to continue, and if you want to persist and believe that what you are standing for is right, so you will go into exile. And that is why we went into exile, to be able to continue the work we are doing. If I come back to the whole picture, as you were asking earlier, the thing is that in Africa, in many African countries, including Burundi, of course,
Indeed.
you really believe, maybe the leaders don't understand exactly what is democracy, what is justice, what is human rights, what is rule of law.
Hunger for power leads to consolidation of the same.
All what is being done is all except justice, except democracy, except human rights, except rule of law. And you wonder, why is it that human rights actors and leaders cannot understand each other, cannot agree? Why do the leaders don't receive positively the message of human rights defenders when human rights defenders are practically helping them?
Indeed.
We are like their eyes and their ears in the community. We see what is not going well. We see what is not happening and what people are expecting and is not happening. And when we raise it, instead of acting on it, they act on you. You become what they call themselves the enemy of the nation because you are helping the nation. Human rights defenders are helping the nation. They are helping the community. And at the same time that we do that work of trying to protect human rights, we also do the work of trying to promote human rights, make the community know their rights, make the community understand how their human rights must be respected. And I'm not talking about only socio-political human rights or
even economic.
Or economic human rights. We will talk all the rights, even the right to education, the right to health, the right to dignity, to life. All these are human rights that people need to know. Because sometimes you are tempted to say, okay, if that is the way, okay, I will be silent, I will go in my corner and wait until it goes. But while you are sitting in your corner waiting until it goes, it can also touch you. So
that's why it's everybody's business to defend human rights.
Business. The human rights is not only my business and the business of my colleagues, it's the business of everybody. Those who are in the charge and the communities. Everybody is concerned by human rights. So it's something really that we should be able to agree on and work on together.
As James Bidal says, there's resistance from the state actors. We would like to know whether in Burundi you're also suffering the same, especially, he says it's not only, the threat is not only coming from government, but also the communities. We'd like to know from Burundi, is it also the case? Are you having threats coming in from community members?
No, the only threat we get from the communities are those members of the community who are being directed and commanded by the ruling party.
I see.
We have, like, for instance, a youth wing we call Imbonerakure in Burundi. That is really the very harsh part of the human rights violation, but they are working under the command of the ruling party and security services. So it is not really the community. What I know from the community is sometimes the community can oppose human rights promotion actions because of not knowing and not understanding. I give you an example. When we were doing the advocacy for women economic empowerment, we touched on the issue of women access to heritage. And you know, the president himself, Pierre Nkurunziza, he came out to say that, yes, I consulted many members of the communities, including women, and they say that, you know, our culture does not allow it. Now, this is what the Speaker of the Parliament is using to say that our culture, yes, patriarchy, it has been there, but we don't, our culture is not static. Culture is dynamic. It keeps changing as things change. So our people, because they don't understand, they take advantage of their ignorance and want to play on it. It's not that people don't want progress. It's not that people don't want to develop.
Indeed.
It's because they don't know. And if they don't know, you, the leader, you have the vision to take them from where they are to where they should go.
Indeed.
And that is what we are trying to help to do, which they don't understand. We are not understood. And what I can say also, which can be compared to what is happening in South Sudan, is the fact that human rights defenders are not allowed to work in a context like Burundi today. Today, human rights cannot gather people, for instance, to train them on human rights, to raise their awareness on human rights. That is not allowed. Because the leaders know that the moment everybody knows, probably they can act differently and get out of silence and start now claiming their rights. So they don't they don't want them to know their rights.
So they want people to stay in the dark about human rights.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Go ahead. So what is the fate of human rights defenders within Burundi? I mean, you had to flee to Rwanda. So we are talking about those who decided to stay. Can you paint for us a picture of the fate of those individuals who decided to stay in Burundi? How is life for them?
Not easy, but they try. It's also good for us when we are doing this promotion of human rights, advocacy for human rights. It's also good for us to have those who decided to remain at home, because it is through them that we can get the information, the accurate information. So they will not go out and speak out, but they still work with the communities, gathering information and trying to be active in other ways. You know, you can organize like a training on entrepreneurship.
Indeed.
And within that training still tell them about human rights, but it will never be put at the title training on human rights. That will not be accepted, but using training on professional education, vocational education, and then you bring in human rights, that can work. But the most important thing they are doing is helping us to access the communities and access information, which is very good. We need it.
That is Dr. Marie-Louise Barichako. She is the chairperson of Movement in Amahoro. They've been giving us a situation analysis of what is happening in Burundi. James Vidal gave us a situation analysis of what is happening within Southern Sudan. And Memory Bandera gave us a situation analysis of what is happening to human rights defenders within the East and Horn of Africa sub-region in that regard. Within Uganda here, by 2020 there, the 3 years earlier, we had 38 NGOs and broken into, their offices broken into within this country at the hands of security operatives. By 2021, that is last year, 54 NGOs were shut down, and they were largely working in the governance and accountability spheres within this country. So the government is really, really critical of these individuals, despite the fact that they are doing great, great work. So we would like to know, as Defenders, the Secretariat of the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Network, what are they doing to safeguard the human rights defenders within this sub-region who are grappling with all these inefficiencies or insufficient moves that are being orchestrated by the central governments? All right, Memory Bandera, what are you doing as Defenders to safeguard human rights defenders?
So there is quite a bit that we do in that regards. First of all, we are known for protection and promotion of human rights defenders' work. So we come in as the first line of protection. If a human rights defender is at risk, we're able then to come up with specific tools that we can employ to make sure that human rights defenders are safe. What we look at is we want to make sure that human rights defenders are safe in their own communities, in their own localities, in their own countries. The situation where human rights defenders have to be in exile is a last resort for us. So we do whatever we can, working with local partners, working at times also with the government, having dialogue with the government. How do we improve the working environment of human rights defenders within their own countries? So those are some of the things that we look at. What are some of those things that human rights defenders can do, the tools they can put in place to make sure that they are safe and continue to do their work in their own countries. When everything fails, then we do then employ our Ubuntu Hub Cities initiative. So of course the Ubuntu-ness coming from our Africanism of protecting one another. When you're at risk, I protect you. When she's at risk, she protects you. So through that Ubuntu Hub Cities, we are able then to look at different alternatives for human rights defenders to continue with their work, not to be silent, but to be safe. So we look at the no harm policy. We want to make sure that we don't lose lives. People still have their lives and they're able to continue with their work. And the way that we do this is through a relocation program. And we have Ubuntu Hub Cities in different countries. Uganda is one of the safe countries that we look at. And in that regard, I also want to take the opportunity to actually thank the government of Uganda.
This country, Uganda, is one of the safe countries where you bring human rights defenders.
Yes.
And not so long ago, a journalist, that is Kenneth Kavulu, was arrested in Mengo and is being held in Communicado.
So I want to clarify on that.
We would like to know why you think Uganda is a safe haven.
Yes. So I might not be safe in Kampala, but I might be safe in Barara.
People like
I
me
might
want
be
to
safe
flee,
in Masindi. Yes. I really want to clarify on that because all said and done, there are people who have a safe haven in Uganda. They have lived here and they've gotten the protection from the government of Uganda. And we have to acknowledge that because it is important. If you look at the number of refugees that are in Uganda at the moment, including human rights defenders, it's an overwhelming number.
But as journalists, Memory Bandera, we do not feel safe anymore. We are being targeted.
And that's why we have these hub cities. So if you don't feel safe in Uganda, we look at the other cities that we have. We have Pretoria in South Africa. We have Johannesburg. We have Cape Town. We're able to relocate Anglophone human rights defenders in those cities. We also have Accra in Ghana, where you can be relocated. And then for Francophone human rights defenders, we have Ivory Coast. So people can also be relocated to Ivory Coast. If you speak Arabic, we can relocate you to Tunis. If you are Lusophone, people who speak Portuguese, you can be relocated to Cape Verde. So where I might be safe, you might not be safe. And vice versa. So that's why we have this Ubuntu Hub Cities, this relocation program. It really looks at what can we do as defenders to make sure that an individual is safe. We move them from point A to point B. You might actually be safe here in Uganda, but in a different district. So you move from one district to another where you're safe. If you're being pursued by your community, you might just need to move from one community to another. If it's the state, you move from one country to another. And that's where we really come in as defenders, because then we have a regional perspective of what's happening across the region, not only within the Eastern Horn of Africa, but across the continent through African Defenders, which is the Pan-African Human Rights Defenders Network that we host here in Uganda. So that gives us a lot of leverage, a lot of room to provide protection to human rights defenders, including journalists. So when we look at human rights defenders, we're looking at individuals, we're looking at organizations that are working to protect other people's rights, and journalists among human rights defenders. So other categories that we prioritize as an organization are human rights defenders that are working on women's issues, because as women human rights defenders, it comes with its own complexities. So we do take women as a priority group. We also look at people who are working on environmental issues, extractives, land issues. That's a category that also often has very difficulties in conducting their business. And then we also look at indigenous people, minority groups. They also have their own peculiar issues
Indeed.
that they deal with. We look at people who are working on ending impunity. So when people start talking about corruption, especially high-level corruption, they come in the limelight and they become a target. So we also look at them. You have noted also that when we go into elections, there are a lot of issues that emanate from that, pre-election, during elections, and post-election periods. That's also another category that we prioritize. And journalists, because then journalists are usually a vehicle that projects some of these issues. They bring some of these issues from the ground and projects them. So those are some of the categories of human rights defenders that we prioritize.
Indeed.
And of course, it doesn't mean that those are the only human rights defenders that we work with, but those are the ones that we pay more attention to because of the peculiar issues that they deal with and the associated risks that they face.
Memory Bandera, during the age limit debate of 2017 that was so heated, after that the president came out and said, well, human rights defenders are having imperial interests. Imperial interests. That's what the president said. And what we saw that followed next was a crackdown on NGOs. Like I just told you, last year 54 NGOs were shut down. Now those human rights defenders were working in the spheres of accountability and governance. And this was after 5 years or 4 years after the president had said that, you know what, these individuals have imperial interests. What can you say about that?
So
Is it true? Do they have imperial interests?
I think this goes back to my original definition of a human rights defender. Human rights defender, it's you and me, making sure that whatever rights we have in our communities are protected and upheld. Now, the problem that comes in is when we speak out. We come out in the limelight, we're holding people accountable, we want them to give us answers, we want to see action on the ground. That's where the issue comes in. You know, a human rights defender is somebody who is actually supposed to support the work of the state. And in this case, when you talk about these issues in particular, most of the human rights defenders that we work with here in Uganda are people who are actually promoting the agenda of the government. Because then when you talk about some of these rights, education is everybody's business. Health access is everybody's business. The right to vote, political rights are everybody's business. So I think the problem really comes in when people are outspoken, and I think because of the funding mechanism, because then most organizations do not generate their own funding. So then when you bring in the funding aspect, then people look at it as if you're carrying other people's agendas. But when you look at our own African traditions, our own norms and how we live, some of these are already enshrined in how we live. In communities, when you go, they do not condone stealing, they do not condone certain things to happen. So we already have our own values and systems as Africans. And what we do when we talk about human rights, it's really amplifying them. The only difference now is that you have all these instruments that sort of like guide how we promote those rights. You look at the Constitution, for example. Here in Uganda, you look at the Constitution of Uganda. What's enshrined in there actually talks about what we need to do as citizens, what the state needs to do. So when individuals come up and they're raising up these issues, they're only emphasizing what's already in the Constitution.
In the Constitution.
Yes. Uganda also ratified different protocols. You have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. You have different instruments at the UN level, including the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. So it talks about protection of individuals who speak truth to power. So those individuals are already doing what is within their mandate as individuals who want to make sure that everybody's rights are upheld.
Memory Bandera, Director, Programs and Administration at Defend Defenders. She comes with a wealth of information, just like you've heard from her submission. We also do have James Bidal, Head of the Secretariat at the South Sudan Human Rights Defenders Network. James Bidal, we would like to know what your team is doing as the Head of Secretariat, of course, to safeguard the human rights defenders within South Sudan. Bring us up to speed with the interventions you've put in place to build resilience among these beautiful people who are working so hard to ensure that the human rights of the people in South Sudan are protected and observed.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, working in South Sudan is quite interesting, and in one way we are also trying to catch balance, appreciating the platforms that the government has created for us, and particularly by the establishment of the Independent Human Rights Commission, which is our close ally, and with the replication of state-level independent human rights commissions in the 10 states of South Sudan and the 3 administrative areas. So within the Independent Human Rights Commission, we have a Human Rights Defenders Desk that we can liaise with the commissioners. So that has taken us to an aspect of constructive dialogue with the state on the situation of human rights defenders, on how we can best improve. So we dialogue with them and also do a lot of advocacy, particularly when it comes to legislations, because we have examined some of the legislation do not support the work of human rights defenders, particularly when you take national NGOs and also the international NGOs registered under the Relief and Rehabilitation Commission.
Indeed.
So the NGO Act itself does not give a provision for the work of human rights defenders. So every organization that's doing human rights work operates on the mercy of the government. So we are working very hard to make sure that, you know, such legislations are repealed or amended to incorporate the element of human rights, because we feel it is something which is cross-cutting. When you also look at our constitution, it guarantees the freedom of expression and opinion, peaceful assemblies and association, and then information and privacy. But such rights are being curtailed on a daily basis. Today, if you want to organize an activity in South Sudan, when you want to assemble peacefully, then you need to go through different processes, like getting clearance, and sometimes your clearance has to be delayed if they don't want you to proceed with the activity. So with this, we have taken it positively by also engaging the concerned authorities to dialogue so that we end such practice. We need to implement the constitutions fully. Another element is that since we are from a conflict context, there are a lot of trauma that is happening, and that is also affecting individuals who are human rights defenders and also the state duty bearers, because everyone in South Sudan is traumatized. So we are working closely with cross-section of the society on trauma healing and counseling, so that they'll be able to redress from the past experiences that they have gone through. We have seen it is a holistic approach that we need to embark on human rights defenders and also those who are holding public offices, because sometimes it impedes the work of human rights defenders. Someone has the word trauma, and again, when you go and talk about human rights, he misconceives you. Particularly in South Sudan, if you talk about human rights, you will be looked at someone who is working to preserve evidence for accountability purposes, because there are a lot of atrocities that are committed in South Sudan. Then there you become a target of individuals and also at the community level. So to some that, I think we enlighten the communities that, you know, what we're doing is to promote their constitutional rights. We're not selling any foreign agenda as perceived by them.
Indeed.
So these are the constructions that we're doing by engaging a cross-section of the society. So much as many human rights defenders are afraid of the government, but we need to work closely with the government to change some of the narratives, and also telling that these are your responsibility, and this is where you have gone well, and this is where it has to be improved. And the issue of legislation is great. Since the country is now reviewing some of the laws, we are advocating and lobbying that some of the legislations has to be reviewed to encompass the element of human rights.
What kind of legislation do you want to see changed?
We have identified some specific legislation, particularly the NGO Act, that does not create a conducive environment for human rights work, and also the National Security Act that gives them unnecessary powers to arrest, detain, investigate without the deep law process. So we find that such provisions within the South Sudan National Security Act are mostly abused by some of the junior officers or people who are acting on their own interests on behalf of the state. So if such provisions will be repealed from the National Security Act, I think it will create a conducive environment for the work of human rights defenders.
All right, that is James Vidal, the head of the Secretariat at the South Sudan Human Rights Defenders Network. Let's also talk to Dr. Marie-Louise Barichako, the chairperson of Movement in Amahoro. We are talking about recommendations. We've largely talked about the challenges and some of the threats that have been levied towards human rights defenders. If there is something we left out, you can compound more on that, Dr. Marie, but we would like to know what are some of the recommendations to the problems we've just mentioned that are affecting our human rights defenders. Go ahead.
There are many.
Indeed. Go ahead. You have time. We have the time.
Human rights defenders must be understood.
Perfect.
This is the first thing, because their motive is positive. They want to help the countries, they want to help the leaders, they want to help the communities.
So the issue of imperial interests is a scapegoat by these central governments.
Exactly. So they should be understood. And human rights defenders should be considered as positive actors. Indeed. Because that is what they are. But instead, they are threatened. They are like in my own country, those who are with us in exile, some of them are under warrant of arrest just because they have stood for human rights, which is regrettable, but it happens. And another thing is that human rights defenders should be given space to work, because it's necessary. It's necessary. And when you are a leader and you are doing your work, you need to know whoever is not satisfied. At least you need to understand why the person is not satisfied. If you can correct, you have to correct. But if you don't know, you will just, if you don't have anybody who steps in and say, this is not working, this is not working, you will do anything.
Indeed.
And you will end up by working on a low level of community satisfaction, because you don't know what is happening.
Indeed.
So this should be considered as really, as I said earlier, as allies, not as enemies. This is something I believe is important. But otherwise, if I want to come back to the case of Burundi, we are still very far, because we are in a situation where our leaders deny the existence of a crisis. And yet, since 2015, we are in a crisis.
Indeed.
But unfortunately, they deny and they speak up in their speeches, whether international or national level, to say there is peace all over the country, when people are still dying, when people are still in prison, when some have disappeared and nobody knows where they are, when others are in exile, a big number of people still in exile, you say everything is peaceful, human rights are respected, justice is there, everything is there, then the issue is that you cannot solve a problem until you acknowledge that you have a problem, and then you start looking for solutions.
Indeed.
So that is where we are today, and the problem is that we still need to reconcile Burundi.
Indeed.
Today, we have we are taking advantage of a situation that the Arusha Peace and Reconciliation Agreement wanted to solve. There were these crises keeping on coming back since independence.
Indeed.
And Arusha Peace and Reconciliation was a long process, but it had really brought some solutions. I don't want to say that it is a perfect instrument, but at least it has the basic instrument solutions we can work on and keep on improving until we finish with this crisis and enter into development. Today we have not reconciled because there is no willingness and there is no commitment, and we ignore the Arusha Peace and Reconciliation Agreement as if nothing happened.
Too much denial happening within Burundi. Thank you
Yes.
so much. That is Dr. Marie-Louise Barichako, the chairperson of Movement in Amahoro. Well, when I was looking at some of the members of the Defenders, I looked at Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Kenya. There was also Southern Sudan. There was also Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Eritrea. But there was none about the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you and I know so well that the human rights violations are so rife within this region. So Ms. Memory Bandera is going to be letting us in on the modalities that are being worked on to ensure that the DRC is inculcated within the defenders. All right, go ahead, Memory Bandera. Efforts to include the DRC. Why are they not members?
So if I may say that as defenders, when we were established, we looked at the official countries within the East African community and also the Horn of Africa. So at that time, DRC was not a member of the East African community. And you know, DRC is also a big country. They are part of SADC. They are also part of Central Africa. And now, especially the eastern part of DRC, we often work with them even informally. But now, during the ongoing General Assembly of the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Network, this is also a conversation that will be ongoing. Do we let in DRC? But before you ask your next question, I wanted to just add on to what Marie-Louise was saying about recommendations. You know, the African Union, which we use quite often as defenders, they came up with Agenda 2063, which is a very good policy framework that looks at what we want as Africans. This is a document that we developed with contributions from all member states. And some of the aspirations there, especially aspiration 3 and 4, they talk about protection of human rights. How do we tap into that as individual countries? How do we tap into that as defenders to make sure that there's protection of human rights defenders? We've also seen that some countries have gone a step ahead to come up with specific legislation that protects human rights defenders. You have Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali. They've all come up with specific legislation. And also here in Uganda, there is legislation that was on the parliament in the last parliament on protection of human rights defenders. And I understand that it's coming back. It's being reintroduced to this parliament. So those are some of the mechanisms that we can look at to enhance the promotion of human rights defenders.
And indeed, it's been a perfect conversation, largely focused on the theme, protecting and promoting human rights defenders is everybody's business. And this conversation had been made possible by Ms. Memory Bandera, the Director of Programs and Administration at Defenders. We also did have Mr. James Bidal. He is the head of the Secretariat at the South Sudan Human Rights Defenders Network. Last but not least, we also did have, that is Dr. Marie-Louise Barichako. She is the chairperson of Movement in Amahoro. Not forgetting my dear sister on sign language. Yes, thank you so much for that good job that you've been doing, Miss Mujawa Ananda, on sign language. My name is Rame Busiku. Till we meet again, have a lovely day.